Hello everyone and welcome to this week's session. Here's just a brief introduction to you all on the two units for week 4 of your course. It's the Introduction to Epidemiology and I'll just give you a very brief introduction to the Stigmas session as well. Remember, you can share some of your learning ideas with us, not only online in the week 4 forum, as you're expected to do, but feel free to tweet us using the hashtag UG_SEXHLTH. Okay, and we all look forward to hearing from each other, I'm sure. This week's sessions, there are 2 units in particular, one focusing on epidemiology and the other one on stigmas related to both HIV and AIDS. Now, at first sight, this may appear a rather strange combination. But in fact, I'm sure as you work through the various materials on epidemiology, you'll see how there's an undercurrent of stigma related both to HIV and to AIDS throughout all forms of science. And that's something that we need to critically explore and critically question. So our focus today, especially with this brief introduction, is on the epidemiology session, but keep in mind the stigmas. Because the stigmas, although they're addressed in a separate folder for you to work through possibly later today or during this coming week, you'll see how stigmas, fears, prejudice, which means prejudgment, discriminations, have always existed right from those early days of HIV. And in fact, even in Lord Fowler's recent book, AIDS, Don't Die of Prejudice, he explores some of the detrimental impacts that stigmas continue to have. So although stigmas may have evolved and changed since those early days, they're still present right throughout the world in different forms. Here in the UK, for example, there was lots of fear and panic and stigma in the early days of HIV. Now you might say that some of the effects of stigma is actually realised by the fact that hardly anything is ever mentioned about HIV, despite us having the highest numbers of diagnosed people living with HIV here in the UK. Once you go onto the Moodle site and check out week 4 learning zone, you will see that I've created 4 separate files here. The first one is this epidemiology session and associated resources. I'll open this little book and show you in a moment. But there's one exercise that you may want to consider at some point during the week, and I couldn't actually get it into the book, so you can see it there in a separate folder. Then the stigma materials are available in a separate book, which is called the Stigma Session and Resources, and you can work through that again sometime during this week. And of course, we want you all to respond in the Unit 4 discussion forum, especially if you go right into that now at the start of the day and start off with the first 2 letters of that KWL. What knowledge have you already got on these 2 different subjects? What knowledge have you got? What more do you want to learn? Especially by processing the learning opportunities presented here on the course. And then finally, go back and review what you've learned over the week and give us some feedback on what you actually did learn. So the KWL, knowledge, want, and what did you learn? Okay? Now, when you open up the book for Unit 4, the one on epidemiology, you'll notice that there are various chapters showing. You can see these listed here, so you just need to click on the title of a chapter to open it. I've tried to put it into some sequential order, so maybe you want to work through it from first through to last. Also, you'll see a new block this week, which is called My Private Files. And in there, I'm actually creating some separate folders, and I'll be building those up throughout the course, putting in not only extra folders, but materials into each and every one of these. And if there's stuff that you have that you want me to display on the course, please feel free to send it to me or upload it yourselves, especially in the discussion forum zone. When it comes to epidemiological categories, and it may be worth starting by asking yourselves what you understand by the term epidemiology. I think I've already mentioned to you that I really am a bit of a word geek. I truly enjoy finding out the origins and the meanings of words. So with epidemiology, it comes from 3 Greek terms that literally mean studying people, or an overview of people. And that's what the scientific term refers to. It's the study of people, but with an overview of those people. But it's important to ask how we actually construct epidemiology, because epidemiology as a science falls into the genre of what's known as positivist or post-positivist studies, especially because of the fact that they use biomedical references which want to look at statistics. Epidemiology wants to look at numbers, how many people are affected, how is an epidemic becoming a pandemic, for example. These are epidemiological categories and questions. But if you explore some of the qualitative research paradigms, especially those around critical theories, so feminism and queer theory are 2 of the key ones that would have an influence, especially around HIV and AIDS. Critical theories ask, well, how did we actually come to these categories in the first place? Who invented them? Because especially with the biomedical sciences, because they try to achieve a particular type of objectivity, they think, oh, it's really pure science if you can be as objective as possible, and to keep the researcher out of this. But critical theorists would argue that this is totally impossible to do, because even the person who invents the categories for measuring in the first place is coming from a position of bias, whether they're acknowledging that or not. And you can certainly see that within some of the categories around HIV and AIDS-defining illnesses. There's a really good little book by a person called Darrell Huff that I'm sure you can buy for a matter of pence now these days on Amazon, because it's been out of print for quite a while now. And it's called How to Lie with Statistics by Darrell Huff. And Darrell Huff says that whenever we're looking at statistics, as I've just mentioned with critical theory, we can't just take this as the black and white truth. You know, it's either one thing or it's the other. There are lots of variables involved. And if you just look at the wine glasses at the moment, and just look at the different ways in which people are expressing exactly the same statistic. So the first 3 glasses show a wine glass. Now, is that half full or is it half empty? Just spend a few moments and have a look at the slide. Notice I've put 4 little red asterisks in, just in case anybody was offended. All right, so when it comes to epidemiology, and this is asking what's in a word, and what's actually in a number. Here on the first part of the slide, showing all these people under a I want to call it a microscope, I've forgotten the word for it now, showing all those people. So epidemiology is definitely the study of people, of patterns, of diseases, of infections, of growth rates, all different types of things. Epidemiology is the study, especially counting the numbers of this. Whereas qualitative research, for example, takes more of a focus in on individuals to see their experience of it. And that's really important to remember as well, that when we're talking about statistics of HIV, people aren't just numbers. People are so much more than numbers. So in the UK now, we're saying that we have just over 100,000 people living with HIV. But what does it mean to live with HIV? So that's where there's a difference between quantitative research and qualitative. And even with the quantitative stuff, as I mentioned, because biomedical sciences are often seen to be a gold standard because of their objectivity and the way in which they may compare and contrast different groups, so there's a methodological formula that's used that's often seen as a gold standard of research. But we must take a step back from all of this and constantly ask the critical questions, such as you see on the screen here. Those questions may involve asking, well, what is it that we're actually measuring? How do we know that we're measuring what we say that we are? Where are we going to find people for this? But also ask yourselves the opposite to these questions. If we're finding people in certain ways, how aren't we finding them in others? Who's hidden from the numbers? Who's not showing? Why aren't they showing? So you can see all of these different questions here. It's really well worth posing these, especially when you're looking at the categories around epidemiology, to ask yourselves these critical questions. Pardon me. There was a time in the early 90s where the UK government brought out many campaigns in which they were showing a globalisation of HIV, and the slogan was, AIDS can affect anyone. It was even the advert showing how this was an infection that could possibly pass. And there was all sorts of terminology being used, especially referring to small, high-risk groups. That was the notion in those early days, that there were people in high-risk groups. And then it could spread to the general population, and it would spread via people that were referred to as a bridging group. So all these are labels, they're categories, and again, from a critical theoretical point of view, it's always important to ask, well, who makes these categories, who defines them, what will their impact be, how are we measuring them? These are all really critical questions to ask. Because there's a person called Edward King who brought out a book called Safety in Numbers back in 1993. And Edward King mapped the sort of historical development of AIDS, as it was first called, and then HIV from the early 1980s up until the time the book was published. He mentioned, especially from an epidemiological point of view, for example, that the UK government found it rather difficult to talk about one of the high-risk groups in which it was talking about. With all the early information, the government had wanted to make leaflets and health promotion campaigns available to people that they saw as being homosexual men. But lots of so-called homosexual men who are happy with their sexual orientation and happy with positive labels really dislike the term homosexual because it's quite a pathologizing term in a way that the term heterosexual isn't. So lots of gay men, for example, prefer the term gay. Some may even use the term queer now. That's a reclaimed term. And there are lots of bisexual men who are happy with the term bisexual. So to use one umbrella term of being homosexual wasn't really acceptable to the community it was meant to be addressing. But the Tory government at the time, as Lord Fowler shows in his book, the Tory government didn't want to use the term gay because they thought, well, gay means happy, and how can anyone be happy if they're seen to be homosexual, which was a very pathologizing concept. So they came out with this acronym, MWHSWM. I'm not sure how you would pronounce that, sort of mishwim or something or other, and it stands for Men Who Have Sex with Men. So in some of the early Health Education Authority, as it used to be called then, the Health Education Authority, some of their leaflets were talking about these MWHSWM. But as you can see, this is a bit of a gobful, and that's now what's been refined to the abbreviation MSM. Personally, as David, I would argue that MSM is just talking about an activity. It's saying that certain men are having sex with other men, but it's not talking about wider concepts of sexuality in relation to sexual orientation or labels that that people may use for that. So certainly, if I'm writing articles referring to gay and bisexual and other men who have sex with men, that's how I prefer to talk about it: gay, bisexual, and other MSM. But there's another problem involved here as well, that if we're talking about men who have sex with men, we may be just considering adults. So it may be more appropriate to talk about males who have sex with males. And that way we're going to remember boys as well as men, but also it reminds us to think of trans men as well, not just adult males. With Edward King's book, he actually spoke about three separate historical epochs, really, in those early days of HIV. He said the first one was what was called the gaying of AIDS, and this implied a lot of stigma, which you'll see this in the next session in this series. So there was a lot of stigma involved because it was putting people into what was called high-risk groups. In fact, in the United States of America, they used to refer to the high-risk groups as being the 5 H's. Homosexuals, heroin addicts, Haitians, people from Haiti, haemophiliacs, people living with haemophilia, and harlots, for commercial sex workers. So in America, they were talking about these high-risk groups, and that in itself was very stigmatizing, it was very labeling. But look at the other side, the flip side of that coin. It might mean that other people would consider that they're not in one of those groups, therefore they're not at risk of HIV. So Edward King explains then that in the early days there was this gaying of AIDS, and he said that that was a time of inactivity, lack of money being spent on it from the point of view of governments, especially if you look in Lord Fowler's book around the United States government and the UK government. Very little was done when it was perceived that only minority groups were being affected. When there was a panic, a moral panic you could say, that there was going to be a spread of HIV to the general population, that's when all the money started pouring in. That's when all the adverts came on television, the leaflets in everybody's house. That's when HIV awareness was really being raised, when there was a fear that HIV could spread to the general population. And that's what Edward King says is the period of the de-gaying of AIDS. But after a time of reflection, Edward King says that there's a real need for a regaying of AIDS, not in the same way as it was in those early 1980s with all the stigma around, but he said when all the money was being wasted on the general population because not all of the general population are at risk of HIV, but to spend millions upon millions of pounds pushing a leaflet through everybody's door, for example, was a waste of money. It's not targeting limited resources to those who are most at risk and most vulnerable of acquiring the infection. So he said there was a need for a regaying of AIDS, but in a way that was totally different to the early 1980s. Now, that was back in 1993. We've moved on considerably since then, and throughout this course we're seeing that there are many more benefits, for example, now about the anti-HIV medications. So if you were to categorize the period now, what would you say would be a key health promotion strategy for attracting the limited resources that are available for those most vulnerable to acquiring HIV infection? Okay, so if you look at Edward King's 3 periods and ask yourselves, well, now what? If we were to redefine our era today, what label would we use for today, looking at the priorities, especially as we now have over 104,000 people living with HIV, of whom over 6,100 were newly diagnosed last year. Even when I mentioned then about people being newly diagnosed, that's important to pay attention to as well. When you're looking at the statistics, so we're back to epidemiology again, when you're looking at the statistics of HIV, and you hear that in a particular year a certain number of people were newly diagnosed, it's worth trying to probe those statistics even further to find out, well, what percentage of those people were newly infected within that year, as opposed to all those who were newly diagnosed. Because this might be a case that somebody's been living with HIV for 5-10 years, and only now they've been diagnosed. So they will show in the statistics of the year in which they were diagnosed, but that's not necessarily saying how many people were newly infected. So to watch the trends of how HIV prevention strategies are working, it's not just a case of having to look at new diagnoses, but monitoring new infections as well. And this is one of the current slides available that you'll see in the resources for this week, showing the categories used by route of transmission. Just have a look at the bottom of the screen and look at the categories being used. Right, so when you're looking at this from a critical point of view, you might ask yourselves, well, who is missing from this? And one group that I often mention, and I'm sure I will have mentioned this in class already, would be lesbian females. There's no category for lesbian females. So it's worth asking the question, well, how many lesbian females are HIV positive? The answer to that is that nobody knows because nobody's asking the question. But why aren't they asking the question? And you might say, well, one of the reasons is because whichever epidemiologist decided that these were the risk categories that needed monitoring, that person didn't consider that lesbians were at risk of HIV. So if a lesbian woman is diagnosed as HIV positive, and if she says that she has at some point in the past had unprotected penetrative intercourse with a male, then she would show here as women, heterosexual. Or if she says that she shared needles with somebody at some point in time, she would show as female, people who inject drugs. So she's going to be miscategorized or recategorized and not showing the fact that she's a lesbian woman living with HIV and whether or not it's possible to pass HIV from woman to woman. If the categories don't exist, and why don't they exist, then how do we know anybody would be in them or wouldn't be in them? Is your glass half empty or is it half full? Okay, and this is the final slide now. I really hope you're going to enjoy these two key themes that you'll be exploring in this week's sessions. So start off with the epidemiology, and then when you're ready, move on to the stigma sessions. With the stigma session, once you open that book, you'll see I've recorded a video. It lasts just for about an hour or so, actually walking you through many of the aspects of HIV and AIDS related stigmas that you need to explore and challenge and look at in different ways as you progress through your course. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy this session.